Today I'm speaking with Faith Blanchard. Faith, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me, Tim.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to speak with you. And in terms of a bio, Faith lives out in Seattle, Washington. I'd love to hear about that part of the country more because I've heard great things about it. I'm sure it's beautiful. She went to Central Washington University, focusing on the topic of family studies. She's also been training as a life coach for several years. She is a life coach at Faith B Coaching. She focuses on holistic intimacy, primarily working with women in their 30s and 40s. She does embodiment work and guided visual, yeah, if I can say it right, guided visualizations and things like that. So if you could, Faith, tell us a little bit more about yourself, about what you do, and anything else about your hobbies or anything quirky we can know about you.
I love working with people when it comes to specifically purity culture. That's kind of like my main focus as a coach. It's a real passion of mine. Had to do a lot of that unraveling myself, so I know how hard it can be. And so that's really near and dear to my heart. I've got a partner who I've been with for 12 years. He's amazing. I have two cats, which are playing on the floor right now. And my hobbies, I love making artisan soap and gardening.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I've got to say we have a little joke in our house, and you're gonna cringe. And I'm sorry. We say we love cats. They taste just like chicken.
Don't worry, my partner is like all about puns. So
So that works.
my cringe factor has decreased over the years. I have a high tolerance.
When I say that kind of thing, my kids are just like, "Daddy, Daddy." Well, so good to hear about your background there, and it's very cool that you do the soaps. I'm very jealous of that. That's a cool skill, and I love how people who do soaps could make soaps without all the chemicals and stuff. So that's really awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're here, of course, to the main part of this is to hear your story. So I know we'll get more into purity culture eventually as your story unravels. But if you could take us back, how did your worldview get shaped as a child?
So I was raised in a small town in Eastern Washington, which tends to be, it's a funny little town because Central Washington University is there. So like half the people are conservative and half the people are liberal. So it's kind of an interesting mix. But I was raised early on. I was raised in a church, in a small town church, and I remember being fairly little and my parents were trying to find the right church. And the one that I ended up spending the most time in was kind of more on the Pentecostal sort of side of things. So there was a lot of like, seeing in the spirit, like, speaking in tongues, demons, angels, prophecy, all of that sort of stuff, visions. Um, which I mean, honestly, is kind of fun. When you're being raised in that, you're like, wow, everything's magic. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
but but then it's such an enclosed space and enclosed mentality. And the older I got, the more kind of extreme my dad became. He got to the point where he really felt like regular normal church was too like of the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. And he really felt like
Hmm.
churches, your relationship with God really suffered from being there, which is kind of interesting because I don't know that I would really argue with that perspective so much. Um, but he ended up actually getting kicked out of the church we were in because, and in fact, the pastor sent letters to all the other pastors in the valley saying this guy's a false prophet. Don't mess around with him. He's bad news. Which
Yeah.
sucked for my dad because the pastor was like his best friend. So it felt like a real betrayal. And I was a total daddy's girl. So I just like, I felt so defensive for him and was so on his side. Which was,
Can I ask when you
yeah,
say he was
yeah.
aggressive with it, was he like hearing visions and stuff, or like what did it look like?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We definitely grew up. And he ended up joining when I was about 10 or 11. He ended up getting together with this like home church, which, home churches are often just cults in disguise. And it really kind of became increasingly more like, oh, there's demons, and he had names for demons, like this is the demon of control and this is the demon of lust, and on and on and on. And
Wow.
so we were raised in this really toxic environment where we were constantly afraid. um and for me, especially being female, my dad was pretty hateful when it came to women. And I didn't really see any healthy relationships with women or have any healthy relationships with women growing up. My grandma, he was really like, every time I saw them together, there was always some big blow up fight. Um, and it's hard for me to know, to differentiate like what was him just having a really unhealthy relationship with his mom and being a really unhealthy, toxic person, and whether or not my grandma was actually also a toxic person, because he really kept us away from most of our family, which is common with abuse. You end up being isolated
Yeah.
from a lot of family and friends because, if you have other healthy relationships, the people in your life are going to be like, you're with an abuser, get out, or they'll try and help you get out. And so we were isolated quite a bit.
Do you think some of
And
that, like the male female dynamics, had to do with his theology and that stuff, or patriarchy,
oh
I should say?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it was just, his own difficulty with sexuality, and his own, um I think he has a lot of self-loathing when it comes to his own sexuality, and feeling like, really, like, control was a big thing for him. Women are trying to control you with their sexuality. Women try to use their sensuality to control you, blah 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 blah. And so, growing up female, and my mom, beautiful, wonderful person that she is, um, didn't really have any safety network, living where we lived.
Mm.
And so, and I mean, they've been living there for decades, and she still doesn't have any really close friends there. And so she was pretty isolated. At one point, between me and my sister being born, they lost a baby. And so she really got depressed, and, living with this very emotionally unhealthy, abusive partner, husband, was not conducive to being able to recover. And so she ended up self-medicating with alcohol. And because of that, I really never had a healthy relationship with my mom. So I was, raised not being able to relate to my mom, not being able to relate to my grandma or the other women in my family because they were all controlling, and, you know, um, and I felt like my dad was the only normal one because he was the only one who actually paid any attention, gave me love, in his own way. Um, it, and it wasn't until I was older that I started recognizing, oh, that's really unhealthy. Um, but I was raised with all of that. And then when I started developing, because I developed pretty early, I got my period when I was 10. I was wearing a training bra by the time I was 9. So I started developing really early, and I got a lot of negative messaging about my body. And, I was jailbait,
Mm.
and, of course, like, don't show any cleavage, and so that started really early for me. I remember even when I was like 11, my dad and I were praying to get, the demons of lust out of me. I mean, I was 11,
It's so
and
sad.
so
It's
that,
funny, but it's sad.
yeah, I mean, it's a real mess. It's a real mess.
Well, just it makes
So
breaks your heart because little girls, any child should be able to just enjoy their childhood, and that stuff shouldn't be on the radar for many more years. And you're
right,
kind of the purity and the innocence and the beauty of just your biggest concern is, can I climb the monkey bars faster than anybody else, and can I swing
right,
higher, can I make beautiful artwork, and it's like that's the stuff that kids should be
yeah.
focused on, not who's looking at me and how do I hide myself. It's just heartbreaking.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I learned from a very early age there was a lot of internalized shame for my body in, pretty much all aspects, whether it was touching my own body because, kids explore, I mean, I remember being really little and being like, telling my sister, like, if you touch this, it feels really good, and that's so innocent and so pure. And I remember, like, from a really early age, just seeing like a naked body. If it was just like a baby, it was so like, oh my God, for me as a little kid. And so there was so much internalized shame that went with bodies for me. And then especially as I started developing, and it was like, oh my God, I'm getting boobs, and it was really, really hard. Um,
Mm.
and 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 as my dad became more extreme with his beliefs, he got to the point where he was like, okay, I'm going to have this ministry where I'm going to go to churches. I'm going to tell them what they're doing wrong so they can have a better relationship with God and be better pastors, and on and on. And kind of became this like, I'm a prophet or I'm an apostle sort of mentality, to the point where he quit his job. We literally gave away our house. And because I know that with our landlord, because we own the house but not the land it was on. And so the landlord that we were paying, um he they never had a good relationship. Like, he was, totally thought my dad was a religious psycho, which, not wrong. So anyway, they had a really bad relationship, and long story short, he wanted us to move, wanted us to get off the property. We had a mobile home, like a, double wide mobile home. And I remember my dad just being like, we got nowhere to put this. We don't have the money to move it. We don't have anywhere to put it. We're just going to give it to him. And God will, we'll give it away, and then we'll receive tenfold from God later down the road. So um, we moved into this old beat up Winnebago. And we had like a pull like camper trailer, and just took all our stuff and went and lived up in the woods. So we were homeless for a bit. And when we left our house, it was early summer. So, for me and my sister, we were like playing out in the woods. We were having a great time. My mom was really suffering. She had to be the breadwinner, which, and because my dad, is like, I'm the head of the household and I'm the pastor, she had to like tithe to him, which is like super, super abusive.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm hearing a few red flags here.
okay,
Just a
just a
few.
couple. Yeah, one or two. Um, so anyway, come like November, his it was getting awful cold. We were up in the woods in Washington state. It's not an easy winter up there. And so his friends down in Portland, this home church that he'd gotten involved in, they invited us to come live with them for a bit. So we did, and that was its own thing. And eventually, after about a year, and it was interesting. I mean, my dad, he had this whole like, I'm a prophet, and he got like a staff and a shofar, and like he had this like headband he would wear, and we would go out into the hills above, a specific valley that he had heard about. Like, we're gonna, pray about this valley, and announce the coming of the Lord, and like stand on the hilltop and do this shit. Excuse my language.
He's
And
he's reminding me of like David Koresh kind of stuff. It's kind of scary.
yeah, it's really not healthy.
Mm.
So that's how my sister and I were raised. My mom was just, trying to get by with this situation, and unfortunately not in a healthy way. And
But you all saw
and there
through it, like you were like, this is you at that age, and even your mom, they all, you all saw it as this is not the right way to live.
Not my sister and I. My sister and I were pretty brainwashed. My
Yeah.
mom really struggled because my dad's he's actually a really intelligent person. Like I remember my grandma bragging, like, yeah, we had him tested when he was little. He's got like 140 IQ, he's a smart man. Um, which means that he argues well and he manipulates really well. And he does the whole like love bombing thing. Um, and then, of course, with that, like with many cult leaders, they love bomb you, and then it's like a tap that they just slowly turn off, and then you're like, I'm dying of thirst here for this love. And so you're constantly trying to earn it for these little drops of love that come out of the tap, but you have to do everything that they want you to do and be everything that they want you to be and think. And it gets to be a real mess.
Yeah.
And so my mom was always like, I don't get it, I don't understand it, but maybe I'm the one who's wrong, and I'm an alcoholic, so I'm the one who's a mess, and all these other people that he's involved in are saying the same thing. And so for her it was really hard to figure out how to function, and figure out, I mean, he really even got to the point where he was like, you're an alcoholic, you don't get to raise my kids. Or at least that way with my sister, who my sister was when she was born, she was assigned male, so she was raised as a boy. She came out as trans when she was in her mid-30s. So she was raised as a boy, and my dad just kind of got to the point with my mom where he was like, you don't get to raise my son. Um, and so my mom, the longer they were married, the less and less power she had. Um, and so, he was really in charge, and especially me. I mean, because my sister's relationship with my dad was always contentious. Um, and my mom and my sister really took the brunt of his rage when he was upset, which he was upset a lot. He's a, very emotionally unstable person. And so they took the brunt of it. And it's so interesting because this was one of the things that I realized, once I was in therapy as an adult. This was like one of the first things that I remembered, was being really little and sitting at the dinner table. And I just remember I was sobbing, and my dad was screaming at me that I wasn't, that I couldn't control him, that I wasn't allowed to control him, and that if I kept trying to control him, well, all of your stuff is mine because I bought it. So all of your toys are mine, all of your clothes is mine, your room, everything is mine. So if you don't stop controlling me, if you don't stop controlling me, maybe you shouldn't be living here, essentially, was the message that I got. So, and it was interesting because I remember not long after that, he came to me. I don't know if it was like within the next few weeks. I remember him telling me he was sorry because he could see a real change in me after that. Because I mean, really, he was threatening abandonment, but there was so much messaging about women being controlling, and like my grandma was controlling, my mom was controlling, and like seeing how bad the relationship was with all of them, and seeing how much like rage um that he um yeah, that he just spent so much time being so angry and so hurtful with them. And I internalized that so much that it was like, okay, um I need to be perfect. And I was so, it was like everything I did needed to line up with what he wanted. And I felt so much love from him when he was loving. So I was getting love bombed. So that was just like reinforcing, like, oh, if I do the right thing, if I be the right person, if I'm good enough, then I'm not going to get hurt the way everybody else is. I'm not going to get rejected and abandoned the way everybody else is. Um,
Mm.
yeah, it was hard. So like the brainwashing really did get pretty entrenched. Fortunately, I was a kid who did well in school, and fortunately my parents, as we got older, um they did encourage both my sister and I to get an education, to go to school and go to college. And so I feel really, really fortunate for that, because there's a lot of people who get raised in religious environments, and the last thing they want their kids to do is to get an education, because then they'll start critically thinking about stuff. And that's essentially what happened. Was the town I was raised in, I ended up going to the university there. So I was still around my parents a lot throughout college. So there was still a lot of influence there, and I really wasn't able to break free. And even with like getting my degree in family studies, um, there was still a lot of like, I'd see something on, families in crisis and what a family in crisis looks like. And it'd be like all of the things that my family was going through. And I'd be like, but that's not my family. Right. Um,
Mm.
so I would justify all of it and like, oh, that doesn't apply to me though. That doesn't apply to my family. Um, and also as well, like with the purity aspect, um and I'm sure you know this, in the 90s and early 2000s there was that massive purity culture movement with courtship. And so between that, as well as like my dad talking about women the way he did and talking about sexuality the way he did, um made it really like felt really dangerous for me to date. And I had really great guy friends who actually weren't really religious. One of them was an atheist. One of them was, I think he was Seventh-day Adventist, but hadn't been raised with nearly as much fervor as what I'd been raised with. And so he was really fairly open. And they were just beautiful, beautiful guys. So I was a total tomboy because, I couldn't really be safe being a girl. So I was a tomboy. Um, and so when I got to be of dating age, I had no idea what to do. It just felt like I was constantly behind or between a rock and a hard place. Like, how do I kiss somebody, and how do I feel these things? And how is that ever going to be safe or okay? So it was constant conflict. Even as I got into my 20s as a college student, I still had no idea what to do. And because I was raised in such a toxic, unhealthy situation and didn't ever see a healthy relationship between a man and a woman, um, and because of my dad being who he was and experiencing like love and abuse at the same time, I was attracted to guys who were like that. But then I had these beautiful, wonderful boys that I grew up with. And I was like, okay, they treat me with love and respect and kindness and acceptance, but these guys don't. So it was like, I don't know. I have this standard that nobody can meet. Oh, and then on top of it, this really like weird religious belief system that doesn't work with regular Christians. So I fit nowhere, and I did not know how to date at all. And yeah, I think I was about 21 when I got my first kiss. And eventually after I left college, I'd wanted to move out of the town I grew up in for a long time. In fact, I didn't even want to go to college there, but I didn't know what I wanted to major in at first. And um because of that, I didn't want to go like I'd originally wanted to go out of state, but it was like, okay, I don't know what I want to do. So I don't want to go to a different college, spend a bunch of money on out of state college and not have any idea what I want and not even know if that's going to be the right college for me. But I ended up at Central, I ended up taking a human sexuality class because it was like one of the required, one like on the list of required courses you could take to meet that particular requirement. And so I took it and I was like, whoa, this is amazing. And it was, I mean, again, like just the weirdness that I grew up in, it was like that was okay. Like I remember telling my dad that I wanted to be a therapist and that I wanted to help Christian couples with sexual issues. And that was okay. It was totally fine. Um, so I ended up falling in love with this major that included these different sexual education courses. And so I ended up getting my degree in family studies. And when I graduated, I left town. I moved to a town about an hour and a half away. So it was still close enough that I could come and visit. Um, and I got a job working part-time with a family therapy agency. Um, and at the same time, I was also introduced to this young adults group through some friends, um, and met this really wonderful young adults pastor, who I became really close with him and his family. He was married, he had four kids, and just loved them. But he was a progressive Christian. And so he started, when we would start digging into things, he would posit these questions that would cause me to really critically think. And it really started this, even at that point, it started the deconversion process because I slowly started unwinding it. And I remember when I was 24, I turned 24, and my friends had this like kind of surprise birthday party for me. And there was this guy there that they wanted to set me up with. So they'd invited him. And I remember talking to him about some of the stuff that I'd experienced growing up. And he was like, really like, ugh. And so later, he came to me and he's like, I'm sorry I reacted the way I did, but some of the things that you said really reminded me of how I grew up. And my parents were part of a cult for 2 years when I was a kid. And it just kind of reminded me of that.
Well,
And it really started this like spinning for me. And I remember the next day, my friend and I went on this hike and I just spilled my guts about everything that I'd grown up with. And I hadn't done that with anybody up until that point. Like there had been, like some stuff, but I just really told her the whole shebang. And it came off as like so spiritual and so deep. And I do feel like that there was a real, like I did feel that connection to God. I really, really felt that. And it seemed like this whole this whole relationship with God, all of that closeness had been built upon all of this stuff being real. And I remember my friend being like, wow, that's so amazing. I wish I had a relationship with God like that. And I remember standing there looking out, we'd gone up this hill on this hike, and I remember looking out and I was like, oh my God, my life is really effed up. And that was when it really started. And it took about a year. I dated somebody after that, who he was really like my first real boyfriend. So I was 24 when I had like my first real boyfriend. And he challenged some of the stuff that I grew up with. And I think and that relationship was really unhealthy and really toxic anyway. But when we broke up, it just like crushed me. And I think it was, it was partly because I was an adult, but I was really like dating the way a 14-year-old would date. I was 24, but really like 14 on the inside. And I was totally crushed. But I was also like, part of the reason why I couldn't get over him and kept pining for him was just all of this like I hate using the phrase daddy issues, but I was really like starting to unpack that stuff. So there was all of this wounding that was coming to the surface that I was starting to deal with. And by the time I was 25, I think I had been diagnosed with depression. And so I got my butt in therapy. And then after that, my therapist diagnosed me with PTSD. And I spent the next year really, really digging into stuff with him. I did. Are you familiar with EMDR?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, so I did EMDR therapy with him, and I remember at first being like, I'm going to tell you stuff and I'm really afraid you're going to tell me I'm crazy, because all of these experiences that I've had with, like, demons and visions and all of that, it felt so real. And I was like, you're going to think I'm nuts. And he's like, no, I'm not. And he was just so beautiful. And he was old enough that he was kind of
Awesome.
like, yeah, he kind of became like a surrogate father figure, which is, like totally transference. But we were both aware of it. So it wasn't like this, just a subconscious, like, you're my new daddy, it wasn't like that. But he he was just so beautiful and kind and compassionate and so encouraging when it came to women's issues and undoing the patriarchy and undoing all of that sexual messaging. Um, and so that was really the first place that I was able to do that, and get that permission to sexually explore, and that there wasn't something wrong with me, and there wasn't something wrong with my sexuality, and that my sexuality was just as pure and beautiful and innocent as anything else. Um, and so I will forever be grateful that I found him. And
Mm.
ironically enough, my pastor was the one who recommended him. And I ended up doing all of my deconstructing in therapy with him. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know if I want to stay a Christian. And so over the next couple of years, I did a lot of deconstruction and eventually deconverted. But that first year, I did so much work with him, and especially when it came to, like, understanding what healthy relationships looked like, what healthy sexuality looked like, because I'd never seen that. There had never been a point in my life where I'd seen that in live. This is how it works. Um, and at one point, I ended up getting a repetitive motion injury, and so between, like, everything I was going on with me emotionally, as well as what was going on with me physically, it got to the point where I couldn't keep doing my work. And my beautiful young adults pastor, he and his wife, they had wanted to. They had several acres outside of town, and they'd set up these, like, cabins on their property for doing, like, retreats with young adults and that sort of thing. And so they invited me to come and live in one of their cabins for free. And so I spent a ton of time with my young adults pastor, like, doing this deconstructing, like, talking about all these things that I was going through and trying to figure out. And he was so beautiful and encouraging and patient. Um,
Mm.
and
Awesome.
he definitely, yeah, I mean, he at that point definitely still, like, reinforced the purity culture aspect. I'm not really sure where he's at with that now. um he's had a lot of life changes too. um but eventually, after a year in therapy, I met my partner, and I remember just being so scared. And, like, the first time, like, the first date we went on, I went to before we went on our date, uh I'd gone to my therapist. I'd had a therapy appointment. I was like, oh my God, we're gonna go on a date. And what if I like him? What if I don't like him? Blah, 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 blah. And he was like, it's just a date. It's okay. You're not committing to anything. And so I ended up, going on this beautiful date with my partner, which that's a whole story. And he's such a beautiful person, and he wasn't raised in the church. He's an atheist. Um, which, for my pastor, not my young adults pastor, but especially, like, I remember telling my pastor, like, oh yeah, I'm dating an atheist. And he was like, don't do
Of
it.
course. Of
Right.
course.
Yeah.
That's
They're
just
not the people you date.
it's just so cool though to hear that that the counseling was such a good experience, even the pastoral counseling, because when you were
Yeah.
saying I spent so much time with this young people's pastor, I was expecting maybe a different end of that sentence, but the fact that you could say that it was by and large a good experience is such a good thing, because so many of those sentences, I spent so much time with my pastor or privately, they end up going very, very
Right.
differently. So I'm very glad it wasn't that
Yeah.
kind of situation, especially mixed with your secular therapist. But that's such a
Yeah.
good thing, and it's to be able to talk it out like that is so precious. The gift of people not being
Yeah.
judgmental and just saying, just
Yeah.
what do you, almost like, what do you think, and they're kind of there to help
Yeah.
you think through it, but they're not as much to like push stuff on you. They're just here to help you
Right.
get your own voice. It's awesome.
Yes. Yes. And actually my first conversation with my therapist, because he'd been recommended to me by the pastor who was like, no atheists. But he had been recommended to me by that pastor because in fact, that pastor was like, you don't want to go for this sort of thing, you don't want to go to a Christian counselor because they're not really certified for what you're going through. Like you need an actual therapist. Um, and so I remember calling him and like, I was like, are you a Christian? And he was like, well, yeah, I consider myself to be a Christian, but that shouldn't be what you're looking for in a therapist. You need somebody who's going to be neutral when it comes to your spirituality because you need to be able to explore safely. And oh my God, I mean, thank God, if you want to use that phrase, that he was that way. And he was so beautiful and loving and accepting and helped me with exploring what I thought was true. Um,
Hmm,
and
that's awesome.
yeah. But as far as like my relationship with my dad at that point, like I'd really, really started to question things, obviously. And I remember when I started therapy, and this I think was part of the reason why I ended up developing PTSD, was because I knew if I started talking to my dad about things that I was questioning, that he would do to me what he did with everybody else, which was, blame, because he was always the victim in all of his relationships, especially with women. And so I spent essentially a year and a half in therapy making sure, that's what it felt like. It was like, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to talk to him, it's going to end up being the end of our relationship. And he was like my best friend. I trusted him more than anybody else. And to come to this place where it was like, oh my God, my life is really messed up. This relationship is really messed up. And it was like finally the all of my family studies training and like all of that finally started kicking in. Like, oh, this is like this is me. This is my stuff. Um
Hmm.
it I spent a year and a half. I had nightmares every night about my dad. I had one nightmare where I'd gone and I'd talked to him about all these things that I believed now and that I thought he was wrong and blah 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 blah. And it was like our relationship was like so codependent and so enmeshed in such an unhealthy way, because I'd kind of become like a surrogate partner for him, which has its own weird sexual vibe even without any physical contact. That is its own thing.
So your mom
Um,
never got back on her feet through all this?
no, no, and they're still married. She was never able to escape. She and I we've been able to repair our relationship in a really beautiful way. So we actually talk every week, and she's getting stronger and she wants to leave. She's wanted to leave for a long time, but she's so scared. But more and more people she's been able to develop relationships with, especially with her sisters, have been really supportive and really loving. And like, hey, if you need to leave, I've got you. This room in my house is waiting for you. Um, so when she decides, she's got support, but she's so scared. Um,
That's heartbreaking.
so yeah, and with me, like my relationship with my dad was it was so codependent that I remember this nightmare in particular that I had, where I told him all these things that I was thinking and believed now, and he killed himself in front of me in this dream. Like, that's how terrified I was, that was, I had to be perfect or he might die. Like, that's how it felt in my body,
Wow.
that I might kill him. Um,
That's so
you know,
intense.
that's what was going on in my subconscious. And so after a year and a half, when I'd finally garnered enough support and love and, enough confirmation, I finally had a conversation with him, and he pulled out all the tricks. Um, and I finally just hung up on him, and I threw my phone across the room, and my roommate, she was in the kitchen, and she came in and just hugged me because I was in the living room, and she saw me throw my phone after hearing this conversation, and she came in and she hugged me and she said, "I'm so proud of you." And I'd been seeing my partner for about 6 months at that point, and he was so supportive and so loving. But it took me years to be able to undo all the brainwashing. Um, and I think about the first 2 years after I deconverted, I it was really interesting because, that part of you that they tell you is like, that's, that still small voice, that's God. That had, been the place where I had felt connected to God, right? And I remember feeling like, oh my God, I've been so betrayed. And that part of me has been so manipulated. I don't want to ever have any contact with you ever again. And it's like I cut that part of myself off. And I didn't realize I was cutting a part of myself off. I just thought I was cutting that, whatever that was, off. Um, and it was like, it felt like I had a big hole, which, of course, when you're raised in church and they're like, yeah, atheists and people who don't believe in Jesus, they have a God-shaped hole in their heart, and so it felt like
Exactly.
and and when you deconvert, it's so terrifying because you're like, if I'm wrong, I'm going to hell.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh my God, maybe they're right. And so it took me probably 2.5 years before I started even dipping my toe into anything religious. And like many people, this was my whole life. It had been my whole life. And even outside of what I was raised in, religion in and of itself was so fascinating to me that I almost majored in it. One of my minors is in religious studies. Um, so, I mean, it had been my whole life, and to cut that part of myself off, to cut off my relationship with my dad, to start, I felt like if my life were a house, that I'd blown it up even down to the foundation and was just trying to like pick up the bricks and figure out what to keep and what to leave out and to throw away. And, I mean, it just felt like I'd burned my life to the ground. And it took a couple years to realize like that part of me, that still small voice, that was part of me. That was my intuition. That was, if you
Mhm.
want to call it your higher self, like if you do believe in God, maybe that is a connection to God or source or whatever. Um, and so I was eventually, little by little, able to invite that back in, and kind of tune back into my own intuition. But it was a really hard process. And with all of the purity culture stuff, the reason the purity culture stuff is so near and dear to my heart is because I had to undo so much of that self-hatred, so much of that internalized sexism. Um, and when I started having sex, the first time I had sex was with my current partner. And I remember the first time we had sex, it was, I remember before making the decision, like, okay, if I'm going to have sex with him, I need to be okay with it if he dumps me 2 weeks from now. Like, oh my God, I gave away my virginity and now I'm trash and I'll never be able to, like, I need to be okay with this. I can't live like that anymore. And so, um, So I did have sex with him for the first time. He's the person I lost my virginity to. And there were aspects to it that were really, really beautiful. And I was able to connect with him in a really beautiful way. And he wasn't raised with all of the purity culture crap. So he was sexually a healthy sexual adult. Um, but I struggled so much with the shame and the guilt. And I knew that it wasn't because I hadn't waited for marriage. I knew it was because you can't flip a switch. You can't just go from, because we're promised if you wait till marriage, your love life is going to be amazing. You're going to have the best sex ever. And if you don't, then it's somehow tied into your relationship with God. Is it Linda K. Klein, I think is her name. She wrote a book called Pure, which I've been recommended many times, and I recently started it. And she talked about in the beginning chapters how you can steal, you can murder somebody, but if you still have your relationship with Jesus, you can be forgiven and still have this beautiful relationship with God. And as long as you repent and but you can't do that if you lose your virginity. Somehow sex is tied intrinsically to your relationship with God, and well, you can never get your virginity back. So it's a done deal. And so when you're taught that, you can't just dive into sex in a marriage when over and over and over again it's drilled into you, don't have sex, don't have sex. It's bad, it's shameful. And then when you get married and you start trying to have sex, that doesn't just go away. That's still trained into your nervous system. And so for me, when I started having sex, the shame, especially upon orgasm, was absolutely crushing. I would have panic attacks during sex.
Mm.
I mean, my partner, beautiful, wonderful human being that he is, every time I started getting scared, I'd be like, okay, I got to stop. And he would stop. And I still had to work through all of the messaging of well, if you start getting a guy going, then you stop, you're just a tease, what a jerk, you're a bad woman. And so I had to really work through that. And he was so beautiful with no, if you don't want to do this, we can stop. It's fine. He was so supportive, but it was so, so hard to work that out. I mean, for years, it got to the point where I just stopped trying to have orgasm during sex because if I did, it was it wasn't worth it. It was so traumatic. It wasn't worth it.
Mm.
There's a
Well said.
phrase, what wires together fires together. And so, as teenagers, it's pretty hard for us not to touch our bodies because our hormones are raging. So if you're orgasming, if your experience with your own body over and over and over and over is sex is bad, this feeling is bad, this sensation is bad, orgasm is bad, all of that gets wrapped up together. So, of course, when you start having sex, if every time prior to you having sex, if you were self-pleasuring and you orgasmed and all of that shame came up, of course it's going to happen in sex. Even if you waited until marriage, it's going to happen. It's not a separate thing. I've known people who, I've known people personally. I've known people who knew people who, even after a year, couldn't have sex with each other. Even after waiting for marriage, they couldn't have sex with each other.
Mm.
And granted, it could be the demographic that I hang out with, but I've known more people who have gone to marriage therapy for sexual issues because they waited for marriage before they did all the, because they did all the purity culture stuff. I've known more people who've had to go to marriage therapy for that than I've known people who had to go to marriage therapy because of sexual abuse. And
Mm.
I mean, it is truly, truly the symptoms of it are really, really intense. And it can also include numbing. just complete numbness, or like, oh, I hate the term frigid, or like she's a cold fish, or whatever that phrase is. Like, that's just a freeze response. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It is a survival mechanism. You are freezing. That's all that is. Because your body has been taught over and over and over and over again that it's a dangerous place to be. That and women, we're taught to be so conservative in how we dress, because, oh, well, we might make one of our brothers stumble if he has a lustful thought. Like, okay, first of all, I don't control anybody else's brain. Second, lustful thoughts are natural and they're beautiful and they're fine.
Absolutely.
And third, like, my body doesn't belong to anybody else. I mean, even just recently, after more than a decade of working, like doing all of this healing work on a constant basis, even just a few months ago, I remember I was doing a practice, and I was laying in bed, and I was just like stroking my arms and my legs and like feeling my skin. And I was like, oh, this is mine. This belongs to me. This doesn't belong to anybody else. This isn't, I have to keep my body pure because my body was bought with a price and it belongs to God, or it doesn't belong to my partner. It doesn't belong to anybody else. It belongs to me, and I can do whatever the hell I want with it. Oh my God. Like, the sensation of that, I knew it in my head, but like to feel my body feel it was completely new. I'm 39. I've been doing this work for years, doing this healing work, and that was the first time I really felt that. And so and that's why I do the work that I do. It's because people need to be free of this. They need to know that their body is theirs. They need to know that they're safe to be sexually active. They need to be safe in their own skin, to be able to undo all of the trauma that comes with purity culture. It's a really, really big deal. Yeah. So that's basically my story.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but I did want to hold off most of them, just because honestly, you're a very good storyteller. I'm sure you've heard that before, but you're very good at telling your story, and I definitely look forward. Like, I want to encourage you to consider a YouTube channel, because you're very good at this. You're very, very good at this. And when I can pick up that someone knows how to tell a story well, I try to keep my questions to the end more. But just if I could throw in a few questions, could you take us back a little bit to your childhood? When you say, your dad was teaching you this stuff, and you knew about angels and demons and all this, there's like a worldview that's just like, you just kind of know that that's all going on. But there's also this very like personal side of it, where it's you in a relationship with God. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Maybe a first good question would just be, was there a time at which you felt like you were being presented with, the whole, watershed moment of, are you going to turn your life over to Jesus, or are you going to live for yourself? And maybe more importantly, or more accurately, are you willing to accept Christ as your substitute for your sin, versus continuing in your own sin, in your own self-righteousness?
Yeah.
How did they phrase that? And was there a time at which you prayed a prayer or something? And and did you have to redo it, or, how did that play out?
Yeah. So I remember I was about 8, and we were still going to regular church at that point. And I was best friends with the pastor's daughter, and I saw her get baptized. And I remember thinking, like, wow, I want to do that too. And so I definitely remember, like, I remember my dad, because he was, very involved in the church at that point. And so he wanted to be the one to baptize me. And so he told me ahead of time, like, I'm going to hold you you're going to lean back into the water, and we're just going to stay there for a couple of seconds. And it was kind of like, so the Holy Spirit can come in, like, the Holy Spirit really needs the water, like needs that time in the water. really absorb or something. And I remember afterwards there were people in the church who were cracking up because one lady, she was like, you held her there for a couple extra seconds, and I was like this close to being like you know. But fortunately he had warned me ahead of time. But yeah, I remember I was about 8, and I really wanted to give my life over to Jesus, and it did feel like it was a choice
Mm.
at that point in time, which, I mean, really, let's face it, when you're raised in that stuff, it's not a choice. It's not a choice.
No.
Um,
And it's interesting too that you bring up the baptism with your friend too, because there is a lot of peer pressure. I remember the same thing where, I mean, it's not like it's explicit, and they definitely tell you
right.
like don't do it unless you're willing to. At least in my Baptist circles that I grew up in,
Right.
like don't do it unless you're really willing to make a profession of faith. This isn't like we're not doing a
Yes.
ritual to earn your salvation. This is just saying if you truly believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior, this is a second step that does not save you. The true baptism of the Spirit is internal, but the external baptism is just an external sign to show the world that you're truly belonging to Jesus. But when
Right.
all your friends are doing it, and it's kind of cool, and there is a lot of peer pressure. I'll just add this one anecdote from my story. I was so embarrassed. They were like, I was at the age, similar age, but you're as a kid, you're wearing these white robes, and I had like under the robe, I was just wearing my tidy whities, and so I went under, and I came up, and like all the ladies were on this one side of the hallway, where no one could see them. All the guys on the other side, and they would like come, like a lady would come in, and she would get baptized. She'd go back out to the lady side, but you could see each
Mm.
other. And when I came back out on my side, the ladies could see over to the guy's side, and I was like see through, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was so embarrassed. So it was kind of like yeah, yeah, I just got baptized, and now I kind of feel naked. It was a mixed feelings there, but anyway,
No kidding.
take us back to your story.
Yeah. So, and it was interesting because it wasn't until I was about 12, 13. So that was when my dad gave away our house. It was just a few months shy of when I turned 13. And that was when like things really started to kind of become more and more I guess intense, as far as like his beliefs got more and more intense, and really I think that's when I really started being more focused on my relationship with God, and because he really encouraged us to, see in the spirit and speak in tongues and do all of that stuff. And so I think that's when it really started becoming truly personal for me, was about 12, 13. And I remember because we moved away to Portland for that year. And we weren't in Portland the whole time. We also, roamed around in our motorhome and went to hilltops and proclaimed the coming of the Lord, with my dad, with his staff and his shofar. And, we did all that stuff for like 6 months or something. And then eventually came back to my hometown. And I remember my best friend growing up, him being like, wow, you've really changed. And I think part of it was also just there was more abuse at that point. That was the first time that I saw my dad get physically aggressive with my mom. Like there was always screaming and yelling in our house, but that time frame was the first time I saw my dad hit my mom.
Mm.
And so there was definitely a shift, I think, for me in, the religious aspects were getting more intense, the physical aspects were getting more intense. And especially my body, the where my body was, like I said, I developed early. My body hasn't changed since I was 14. Like D cup, sorry to get descriptive, but I had boobs, and I was 13, 14 years old with a woman's figure. And
Mm.
and so like the messaging with that as well. Like I remember one time my dad, I don't even remember like why we were talking about this, but he was talking about how, and this was when I was 13, that because I'd gotten my period when I was 10, he said something about like, yeah, you could have been in the back car of some guy's car for the last uh the last 3 years. You could have been in the back of some guy's car getting pregnant. And I was like, I was so shocked that he would say that to me, because it was like, you're thinking that about me? Like, I hadn't even had a kiss yet. I hadn't even held anybody's hand yet. Like, I was barely there. I mean, that's when you're just starting to feel things. I mean, I'd had crushes and stuff, but like not an adult level, not like go get pregnant in the back of a car level. And so it was absolutely shocking. And in a lot of ways, it was a real revelation of what he thought of me and what he thought when he saw my body. When he said that to me, it really impacted how I saw myself. It really impacted how I saw him seeing me. And it wasn't necessarily something I thought of consciously, like, oh my God, he thinks this about me. It was really more subconscious, but he was constantly saying things about other women or other girls my age. I remember I developed a really close relationship with the only other girl in our little culty home church group. I developed a really close age with her, and I was going to go spend the night with her. And I was such a tomboy that, this sleepover, he actually like took me aside beforehand, like, don't do anything. Don't, like he was afraid I was a lesbian, which A, not a bad thing. B, like, why did he think that of me in the first place? Because I was a tomboy, like, and I wanted to go have a sleepover with my friend. Um, so it was like this really negative messaging, like, don't touch anybody, don't, especially not another girl. Um, and then on top of it, my little friend, she also developed really early. So she was also this full-figured girl at 13. And she stood up straight, and she would walk with her shoulders back. And she probably was like, I'm real proud of my body, which, like, girl, strut, like, yeah, you. But he was like, she's like, sticking she's trying to touch her elbows behind her back. And, all of this really negative, toxic messaging I was getting from him with how he talked about even just other girls my age.
As if
So it
everybody was like
was,
being a temptress kind of thing.
yeah, everybody, and I remember him saying like because it was like the demon of sensuality, the demon of lust, the demon of control, and that specifically women really struggled. Like almost every woman was possessed with the demon of control. And
Hmm.
it was just like, there was just no way to view myself in a healthy way, to view my body in a healthy way, to see my sexuality in a healthy way with
Well,
that kind
really,
of messaging.
it really brings up like the mixed messaging too of the self-love versus self-hate, because like there's, like you're saying there with your friend, like there's this natural sense of like, I know I'm a woman, I'm a girl developing into a woman, but I'm proud of my body. I'm just proud to be my own
Yeah.
skin, but I'm proud of how I'm developing. So you kind of like yourself, maybe you enjoy attention or something that it gets you, but and certainly learning the self-pleasuring, it's like there's
Yeah.
a part of you that's like enjoying just being you
Yeah.
and enjoying these new phases of life. But then there's also that self-hate. So it's like a mixture of self-hate and self-love. And especially like if it's just like a cultural, like, very bare bones. I mean, I think it's probably ingrained in so many cultures is, just don't be a slut, that kind of message. Don't
Mm-hmm.
don't be loose. If it's just cultural, that can be bad enough. But then when you're mixing in, like yes, don't do that, but understand that if you go down those roads and you become that kind of person, it isn't just like culturally that you might be looked down on. It's that there's a God in heaven who is profoundly disappointed in you, and even the idea of
Yeah.
like Christ died because you're a temptress, and one thing
Yeah.
too. I think it's just such a shame.
Eve being the perfect example of the terrible woman, and she was the first one. Like, oh no.
Exactly. One example, I interviewed a wonderful lady quite a while ago, but she was a worship leader in church at one point, and she was telling me that she got messaging from her, like people in the church and the leaders, to like calm down, because she would be, it was like a church where you would be like, like jumping for the Lord, and so
Yeah.
with her curves, it was like men were saying, I'm so distracted by her. And it gets to a point where you can't, like you can't, but I mean it's funny, but it's horrible, but it's like you can't be safe in your own skin. And also
Yeah.
you're kind of, in a sense, telling the men at the same time that you're getting all these horrible messages as a woman, you're kind of telling the men, you all are kind of like inherently predators, which is not true.
Right.
But you're like, and
No.
you're teaching the women to be afraid of the predator, or at least the Jekyll Hyde predator side of you, as a guy that's going to
Yes.
come out. If you get a
Yes.
girl in a quiet dark hallway, the bad side of you is going to come out and start doing stuff. But
Right.
the guys then
And you
feel,
caused it.
you caused it, it's your fault, and but the guys feel like, is that me? Like, am I a bad person? And then, of course, when you do get
Yeah.
like a pastor or some kind of spiritual authority saying, no, like you are that kind of person, you are a bad person. And I've used this illustration before, so
Yes.
forgive me for repeating it for my repeat viewers. But when I was at Bible college, I remember the dean of men at one point, he got all the guys together in the lunchroom, the rec room area, and he had like one shot. Like, this wasn't like something we did every week or every month. It was just the dean of men. He pulled to get all together all the guys. It was like 7 o'clock at night, and he wanted to talk to us. And I'm thinking it's going to be like, guys, we're going to change the world for Christ. Get on fire, get in the Word, be a prayer, get on your knees. Pray more. That's just where my mind was thinking. What?
Yeah.
Memorize more. Look for the Spirit's leading. And instead, it was simply one message: guys, stop masturbating.
Mm.
And I just
Yeah.
thought, you got one shot at this for the whole year, and this is the only thing you're going to say to us, as opposed to live your life for the Lord. And it really struck me, and I'll wrap this part up and pass the ball back to you. But as I reflected on that then, and even for years, literally, it's been in my mind for a while. It's amazing to me how so many of us grow up with this concept where it is so many don'ts. Don't think about this, don't do this. But I was always shocked, even as a Christian, and I was literally, like, before my deconversion, I was literally writing a book about how Christians should see the body better. It's like 1,000
Mm.
pages. I never got to publish it,
Mm.
thankfully. It would have been an embarrassment, in the sense that I would have been promoting Christianity, heavily promoting it. But I was like saying to myself, and internally in this book I was working on, like, before you say don't do this and don't mess this part of your life up, you should first be saying, just celebrate how you are created, celebrate your body. Like, I was reading this
Yeah.
one thing, like the man's body on average makes like 50,000 sperm an hour. Like, like that's something really
That's
cool to
magical.
celebrate. And instead it's
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm kind of embarrassed. It's like, that's such an embarrassment to a
Right.
guy to say that. But it's like, why
Yeah.
should you be embarrassed if that's, and even as a Christian, we're saying that, like, you should be embarrassed to say you as a man are creating 50,000 sperm an hour, and it's therefore creating all this pressure in your brain and your body
Yeah.
to be sexually active. It's like, that's an embarrassing thought as a Christian, but should it be? If
Yeah.
you believe that God made this stuff, why is
Yeah.
this so oppressive? And it just, it blew my mind away, the way that it's like, celebrate your sexuality 1,000 times, and then say don't maybe 10 times. But it was very much the
Yeah.
opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it creates this real unsafety within your own skin, and that's part of what I really want to work with people on repairing. In because we grow up with this, like, our body and our spirituality are pitted against each other. It's like they're adversaries. The flesh is weak and all of that, so you have to, like, wrangle it, otherwise you could do something bad. And especially with sexuality, and it's like, why? This thing is magical. Look at all the things that it does. It's so powerful. It's so creative. Like, even, like, for me, my trauma from growing up the way I did was so toxic physically and emotionally that it ended up, like I think I mentioned that I'd had an injury and needed to that my young adults pastor and his wife took me in for a period of time, um, because it continued to get so bad that I developed chronic pain in multiple places in my body, and I couldn't work anymore. And I spent like 2 years trying to find a job where it either wouldn't trigger the trauma or that I could physically do it. And I could never find anything where I could physically and emotionally handle it. So and the more I pushed myself, the worse it got. And so I ended up having to apply for disability because it was so bad, which, for anybody who's ever had to apply for disability in and of itself, that is a super traumatic process. Um, and so I mean, it was just like it doubled down and doubled down and doubled down. Um, and so this idea that the body and the spirit are these like adversaries is such a toxic belief, and you can't truly be whole and aligned with your life if that's what's going on. Like it's constantly like this. Like you can't have an aligned life when it's like this. It doesn't work. And so
Mm.
and it's hard because it's not, like you were saying, like just culture in and of itself supports this. Like fortunately it's getting better, but the whole like you were saying, like slut shaming, um it's, even after deconverting, it can still be so hard to find a healthy balance with your body and with your sexuality when those messages are still so entrenched in the wider culture.
Yeah. I think it takes so much work to really just get rid of the shame. Like I know for me, it's one of the it's been one of the most challenging things, but I think also very much worth it. Like I was reflecting,
Yeah.
I'm working on some purity culture presentations myself for the long term and for a completely separate YouTube channel. But as I think through it, I was thinking to myself, you don't have meaning like me talking to myself, like you don't have any sexual shame at this point. Like you're not ashamed at all of any of your desires. And I was like, that's really different from like how I grew up. But it took a long time,
Yeah.
and obviously it took deconversion. I don't think it could have
Yeah.
been possible without deconversion, but it's a lot of work. It's
Yeah.
just the idea too of realizing, like you said, this is about dualism, the mind versus your body versus the rest of you. But when you also realize that, I mean, this is my opinion, but when you realize you don't have a soul, that you are a body, and that
Just all
you're
one thing.
this is all one thing. Like it isn't like even that you're getting your body and your spirit. You're just getting into your body and your body. Like you're just
Yeah, right.
like this is it. Like this is who you are. And I think
Yeah.
too that there's this sense though as a Christian, what you said really was triggering memories of verses where Paul talks about that we're physical here, but we're going to be raised spiritual. And it's almost like this sense of like, I can't wait to die so I can, number one, of course, see Jesus, but
Yeah.
I
Get
can't
rid
wait
of
in
this
heaven.
thing.
Yeah, I can't wait to get rid of this. This is like it's like a dead weight. And the idea
Yeah.
where Paul talks about the sin in him, as if he literally describes, I think in Romans, as if it's a dead body that's attached to him and he can't get rid of it. And this drive to finally be free of the body. But when you realize that there is no afterlife to be waiting for, you realize you're just trying to get rid of yourself, and that's where it comes back to self-hate.
Yeah.
And why self-love is so
Yeah.
critical. But I literally
Yeah.
do know people that see this body as just purely like, yeah, we kind of have to have sex as we have to have babies, and it's like it's such
Right.
a big
It's an
drive that if you don't have
obligation.
sex that you're going to end up fornicating. But like in the best
Right.
picture, like Paul even says, like, I wish you guys were like me. I wish you were unmarried. And I remember in the book of Revelation too, it talks about um these people that were highly praised, and it says they are pure, they've kept themselves virgins like forever, like they've always been virgins, and now they're virgins in heaven. And it was like this praiseworthy thing, like if you kind of have to have sex because you're so worldly, but if you could theoretically think of what's the best version of you possible, the best version of you
Yeah.
would be a perpetual virgin. And to not
Right.
just like by rules, but that you truly want that, you don't want to be doing this stuff. And you get
Right.
this such a interwoven message of this stuff is just, it's literally part of Satan and sin and selfishness, is desire to transform you into something really horrible. And you feel like you're a monster when you're
Yeah.
just a human. And it's so
Yeah.
sad.
It's
So
like
sad.
Jekyll and Hyde. I don't know when the monster is going to come out. You're
Yeah.
scared of yourself. And I think that messaging, I think that's part of the reason why um, a lot of us end up being so numb when it comes to sexuality.
Yes.
Why women, so like biologically, from what I understand, according to science, um, women, unless there is some sort of damage to the nerves, like scar tissue, like there was literally an injury that caused damage to the nerves, with, barring that, women are biologically capable of having an orgasm. All of us. With, if there's no injury, if there's no damage, all of us are capable of orgasm. And yet, so many of us don't. Like we can't. We try so hard and we can't. And so like there's this sexual dysfunction that comes with pushing for numbness so hard. And I do think that, potentially it could be, that inherited trauma response. Like, okay, women have been subjugated to a lot of crap for century upon century upon century, being the property of somebody else. They're literally not even able to own their own bodies. Um, so
Which the
there's,
Bible also says.
potential, right? So there's potential for it just, that alone being a factor, let alone all of the cultural factors, all of the religious factors where we're just numb, 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 numb. And there's I wish I'll have to look up the study. I think it's fairly recent. The Global Center for Religious Research, they have a conference every year, and there was somebody who presented there this year on purity culture. And they found, when they compared in their survey, the level of dysfunction among people who were raised in purity culture versus the general population. And the disparity could be even greater because I'm not sure that they separated out in the general population. I think they were taking like, CDC statistics or whatever on, I don't know, the CDC is the one who does that specifically, but statistics on general population of sexual dysfunction. I'm not sure that if they were taking just like that, then people within the general population have experienced purity culture. So the disparity, if they had separated those people out, could be even greater. But just going off of what they showed in their study, if they took the general population, the statistics with that were that people in the general population, about 43% at some point experienced sexual dysfunction, whereas people in purity culture, it's literally double. It's 86% of people who are raised in purity culture at some point experience sexual dysfunction. And I have myself as well, which can be numbness, lack of orgasm, lack of turn on, pain during sex. I mean, it's a big deal. It really, really affects our bodies.
Yeah. It's so sad. And I think too, part of it is got to be, I'm sure, psychosomatic, where even
Yeah.
just the basic worldview of like, you think God is looking in your brain, even if you're not actually doing something, he's looking in your brain and seeing your
Yeah.
thoughts and judging
Yeah.
you. um and if you're doing things sexually, even in the right confines, if you're not doing it in some way to honor the Lord, instead you're doing it for the sensuality or the eroticism. And that's
Yeah.
something I love, that word eroticism, because I think so many of us were really afraid of that as Christians. And it's
Yeah.
like, I'm working on, again, another YouTube channel and even some other projects, but like the idea of just like embrace eroticism, it's such a good thing. But as
Yeah.
Christians, we're so trained to think, no, eroticism is too edgy. It's too, like, I should really love my
Dangerous.
spouse. I should really love
Yeah.
being intimate with them, but like eroticism's too much. And it's like, no, no, that's a beautiful, beautiful part of life. But
Yeah.
we associate that with God seeing in your head. He's seeing your fantasy, even, horror of horrors, seeing your fantasies and saying, no, if you've lusted, you've done it as much as you've committed adultery, and
Yeah.
this is a horrible, wicked thing. I do want to
Yeah.
ask real quick, if I could, since we're almost out of time. Um, Number one, I'm going to say this is a topic I feel like we could talk about forever. And so I know we've already talked about this offline, but I'll just say for our audience, um, Faith and I have agreed to do a follow up here pretty shortly, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 months, and just to really dive into this, and maybe even a third one. But we definitely, number one, want to hear more from you about this topic, because this is so critical. And next time we'll focus, less on our deconversion stories and more just on the topic. But since we've only got a few minutes left, I did want to take it back, if I could, to the deconversion part of it,
Yeah.
and wanted to ask, when you did deconvert finally, when you said I'm out, could you tell us, like, what were the final days like when you finally said it to
Mm,
yourself? And were there parts of it that were maybe appealing for you to say, I can't do this. I need heaven.
yeah.
I need a God. I need some kind of purpose, transcendent purpose in life.
Yeah.
And once kind of healed from that phase, a follow-up question would just be, are you still struggling at all with some of the pain or the loss from that time frame?
Yeah. So, it took me, I think the deconversion process probably took me 2 or 3 years total. It was, slow going. I had a lot of brainwashing to unravel in therapy. Um, I was still pretty involved in church when I started dating my wonderful atheist partner. But I think I had always had friends who weren't churchgoers, and part of that was because I was raised in such a weird religious environment where it was like, "Oh, church is bad, church is dangerous." So, I didn't really have, like, normal Christian friends. So I had a lot of support outside of the church, but my partner was the first person, and I remember thinking this. He was the first person who made me feel loved for just being me. Like, it had nothing to do with my faith. I wasn't loved because I was a Christian. He didn't give a crap about that.
Mm.
I was loved for me. And that was the first time in my life I really felt that I was just loved for being me. And I remember, and he was so great. He would actually, he owned a business at that point in time. His only day off was Sunday, but the first few months we dated, he would still come to church with me, and which really surprised the people he knew, because some of them were Christians. They were like, "He's going to church?" um, but it was really funny because I realized we had, like, all the same values, because we would walk out of church being like, "Yeah, that was disturbing." Like, I didn't like that either.
That's awesome.
And yeah, and I remember there was a point where, because I was like, I had talked to my pastor and I was like trying to find these books on basically the argument, like, why should I believe this stuff? And I got to a point where I was like, I don't really believe anymore. I'm just trying to convince myself to believe. And I think that because I had so much outside support, and I was still, going to my therapist, and my therapist was so beautiful through my whole deconversion process and encouraged me to just go after what I wanted to go after, believe what I wanted to believe. So I had so much support, and I'm certain that without that, it would have taken me longer to be able to move through that process. Um, but as far as, like, there are times when I'm still sexually, or still triggered when it comes to spirituality and religious trauma. And I do think that when you deconvert, there still needs to be, like, you do all of the religious deconstruction, there still needs to be some sort of spiritual reconstruction in, like, how you, okay, like, I don't believe this thing anymore, so what do I believe? And maybe it's that you don't believe in God. There, like you were saying, like, this is it. This is it. Like, I'm looking at it. Maybe you believe that, some sort of higher power exists, but it's not what you defined it as when you were Christian. Or maybe even for some people, like I was talking to somebody else about purity culture the other day, and for her, she's just a progressive Christian at this point. So I think that there still is that aspect to healing. And I think for me, like for instance, there was a retreat I went to specifically for coaching people through sexuality. And I went to that this last summer, and I spent a week with about 100 other women running around naked or in lingerie, and we were all like celebrating our bodies, celebrating our sexuality. And at one point, we were doing this embodiment practice where there was a lot of visualization. And I remember there was like this spiritual opening there for me. And I use the term spiritual as kind of like, that part of us that's inherently us, that's also connected to everything else. The way I would consider myself connected to the earth. We're all made of the same stuff. We're all connected in that way. And so I remember at one point, one day I had to stop. We were doing a breathwork practice, and I had to stop because I felt so open, and I was like feeling all of that religious trauma starting to bubble up. And one of the people that they had on staff for the retreat is a trauma specialist. And so we went and had our own little EMDR session, working through some of that religious trauma. So there are points, even after, more than a decade, that I'm still healing parts of myself. So, and I think that's really, really important for people to know, that it's okay, that it takes time. It can take a long time to work it out of our system, and that's okay. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It just takes time, and it's okay.
Yeah, especially if you have any like current triggers, if you have family or friends, parents trying to get
Yeah.
you back into it, it just prolongs some of
Yes.
that.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
can, for
D-
sure.
could you contrast or compare the peace you had as a Christian versus, and I don't mean all of it, I mean
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
taking away some of the worst parts of the hard conversations with your dad.
Yeah.
But just like when it was more, you, and either it was good memories with your family, or it was just you alone with God, or you in church alone praying. When it's you and God, that peace versus deconversion, how did that compare?
Yeah. I felt so much less fear. I remember feeling like, oh my God, I don't have to believe this stuff. I can doubt. Oh my gosh, I can do anything. Like I could believe anything. I could explore anything. And it just felt like this like wonderland of adventure. Um, and I think that like I mentioned that, like 2-ish year space of time immediately after I deconverted, that I felt this big hole. And it took a while to reconnect to that part of myself. But once I did, it was like, okay, this is the part of me that, like, I don't know if, I think we all experience this at different points, but maybe don't necessarily consciously acknowledge it. But, parts of times when you're like, oh, this is like, I deeply know this, like I remember the coaching program that I joined last year. I had thought, okay, I'm going to push this out until 2024. I'm going to do it then. But I scheduled a call with one of their people, and, because I wanted to learn more and just kind of like make sure, yeah, this is for me. And she was like, I really think that this is something you should do for 2023, not 2024. And it was like that part of me just felt so solid. Like, yeah, I know that. I can feel this. Um, and so for me, I think that that's really like that part of us that's intuitive, that connects us to each other, connects us to, the earth. I'm a gardener, so like a lot of like how I think about God comes from nature,
Yes.
and how I feel connected to the earth, or like how, life and death work. Like It's a beautiful process. It's two sides of the same coin. There's sex, life, and death. They're all mixed in. And life creates death and death creates life. And I think that there's definitely parts of me that I feel nervous exploring, and especially like, if I'm going to have faith about something, which is interesting because I do think that I've been, um, I don't like using the word, called to with Christians because they're like, called to, with deconverted Christians. Whereas, somebody who's not raised that way is like, oh yeah, this calling. So I kind of like think of it like if I weren't a Christian, I would say calling. But how I want to expand my business this way to so many other people because there's so many people who need help with this. And I feel like, okay, I'm like tiptoeing slowly, having faith in this calling for me to be able to do this work. So it's still nerve-wracking being able to trust that part of myself. Um, and I do think that it's something that we practice. It's like anything else that, it's like riding a bike sometimes. But I do think as far as like peace goes, I feel significantly more peace with that connection because it doesn't feel like it's constantly under threat. Like, oh, it's going to be taken away if I do the wrong thing. Like, man, I can do all sorts of stuff. Like, and it's okay. And I wanted to touch back really fast on what you said about eroticism. I think part of the reason why eroticism is so scary is because you are fully inhabiting your body when you are getting into that, and our bodies feel like such a dangerous place. It
Yes.
just feels so scary. And so to me, being able um to find peace after deconversion was so natural in a lot of ways once I finally kind of like was able to really understand that part of myself, that still small voice that everybody told me was God, was just me and just my connection to what is. um I
Mm.
hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's a great way to put it. Well, I definitely appreciate so much. I've got a lot more questions, but we'll definitely save them for the follow-up. But this has
Yeah.
been awesome. I love your energy, and I think too, just you're bringing like this the topic of sex and sexuality and eroticism among a few other topics. To me, it brings it down to a big life change, which I think a lot of people have talked about in interviews, which is just this idea that when you escape these horrific worldviews, you are so free. But the freedom, once you get past the scary part of it, it makes life ultimately much more beautiful and meaningful, and
Yeah.
your passions come out. And I feel like
Yeah.
sexuality and eroticism is a big part of it. But even like for me, like I've been writing poetry and songs and making art like never before. And it's just like
Yeah.
your whole world just is like you want to. I mean, I know Christians can still create art and create things, but they're doing it obviously for mythological character. But to just do
Right.
it just because you love life, and
Yeah.
with you're not doing it to earn a reward in heaven. You're not doing it to create a an ambiance for church, so people
Right.
worship better. You're just doing it
Right.
because life is beautiful. Life is short.
Yes.
So shine, seize the day and shine as bright as you can while you're here and make a difference for the next
Yes.
generation. But to give people that sense too
Yeah.
of like, it is scary to deconvert, but it's going to get a lot better. And honestly, it
Yeah.
is so much more peaceful and beautiful after you've,
Yes.
gotten regrounded.
And
It
you can
just,
really blossom.
yes, absolutely. And
All
of
the
course,
parts of you had to squash, you just
hmm, I love it. And of course, bringing it back to the main point of what you do, the ability to flourish and blossom in the area of sexuality, both in your own head and your own thought process, your own worldview, but also in your relationship with your partner. It's just such a beautiful thing. So, well, I look forward to digging in
thank you.
deeper with you on these topics soon. But did you have any final words you wanted to say before we wrap up?
I'm just really grateful that you made space for me on your channel. I'm really glad that I got to do this with you. This was a blast, and I'm really excited to talk with you further on this subject.
Awesome. Well, likewise. I want to make a prediction. I think you are going to be a fan favorite of this channel in the long term. So I think people are going to love what you've got to say. And because I mean, honestly, it's not just you have an awesome personality. You're a great storyteller, but also I think people are dying for better thoughts about these topics, and I think you're bringing some of them to the forefront. So I'm very much looking forward to having you back. Well, I'll just wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Faith Blanchard. Faith, thank you so much. Great to hear your story and your insights, and we'll definitely do it again shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Faith.